"I think I was closer to retiring than changing teams," Max Verstappen admitted, the moment his new Red Bull contract through 2030 was officially confirmed. A startling confession that completely reframes what we thought we knew about his commitment to Formula One. He wasn't bluffing for leverage or playing games with McLaren, he was genuinely questioning whether he even wanted to stay in the sport at all. Yet here he stands, having just signed away another 4.5 years of his career, to a team whose own technical director publicly declared they have no confidence in their current car just 7 days earlier. That is the tension nobody is talking about right now. Why would the best driver on the grid lock himself into a deal until the end of the decade, when the RB22 is reportedly falling apart underneath him and every lap feels like survival? The answer isn't found in the press release praising mutual trust and ambition. It's buried in a series of private conversations and regulatory back channels that suggest this decision had almost nothing to do with winning races in 2026 and everything to do with reshaping what comes next. We need to understand exactly what changed between Verstappen telling Laurent Mekies early this season that he didn't even know if he wanted to stay in F1 and standing beside him at Zandvoort to announce this massive extension. Something fundamental shifted in those intervening months. Something powerful enough to override both his documented frustrations with an undrivable car and the persistent paddock whispers linking him to a rival seat. Was it purely the relationship with Mekies? Or were there guarantees made about the future of the engine formula that haven't been officially announced? We know discussions happened, but the scope remains deliberately vague, leaving us to wonder if Verstappen has secured assurances the rest of the grid hasn't seen yet. This ambiguity is critical because it means the public narrative of loyalty might actually be masking a calculated bet on regulatory reform that could redefine competitive balance before most teams even realize the rules are moving beneath their feet. The timing itself raises more questions than it answers. Announcing this ahead of his home race at Zandvoort creates maximum emotional resonance, but it also conveniently distracts from the fact that his teammate Isaac Hadjar is missing the weekend with a wrist injury sustained during summer break training. Liam Lawson steps back into the exact same Red Bull seat where he made his debut in 2023, creating a poetic symmetry that dominates the immediate news cycle, while the deeper implications of Verstappen's admission quietly settle into the background. But that admission doesn't disappear just because the cameras have moved on. It hangs over every remaining race of 2026 as a reminder that even after signing the longest extension of his career, Verstappen's presence in Formula One remains conditional on factors far beyond podium finishes or championship points. The contract is inked, the retirement threat has passed, yet the underlying uncertainty that prompted it hasn't been resolved. It's simply been deferred to a future date that none of us can fully predict. That specific phrase about retirement wasn't a throwaway line delivered to deflect awkward questions from reporters. Verstappen repeated it when asked directly if he had spoken to rival teams, using humor to deliver what is arguably the most honest assessment of his mental state we have heard in years. He joked about it via ESPN on August 20, but the data point underneath that joke is deadly serious. Earlier in the 2026 season, he had explicitly told Laurent Mekies not to even raise questions about his future because he didn't know if he wanted to stay in F1 at all. That wasn't negotiation posturing. It was genuine existential doubt, documented by multiple outlets, including The Race and ESPN, as evidence of how open the situation truly was before this resolution. He stayed, but barely. The gap between walking away and signing through 2030 was apparently razor thin, which makes the final outcome feel less like a victory lap and more like a reprieve. Most drivers extend contracts because they believe they can win immediately. Verstappen extended despite knowing the current machinery is flawed, citing trust in a process rather than confidence in present performance. That distinction matters enormously for how we interpret every remaining race this year. When he climbs into the RB22 at Zandvoort or Monza or Singapore, he isn't driving as a man securing his legacy with dominant victories. He's driving as someone who almost left entirely and chose to stay based on faith in conversations that haven't yet produced tangible on-track results. The paddock reaction reflects this complexity perfectly. Formula One. Com's own analysis framed the re-signing as significant precisely because of how uncertain everything looked mid-season. This wasn't a formality waiting for paperwork. It was genuine retention against real attrition risk. Motorsport. Com ran an explicit panel where writers debated whether the deal was surprising or inevitable, reflecting that even professional observers couldn't read the signals correctly until the announcement landed. ESPN and Sky Sports both led their coverage with the retirement quote rather than the contract length, understanding instinctively that the emotional truth mattered more than the calendar dates. So, where does that leave us right now? We have a champion committed to a team whose technical director admitted no confidence in their car just 1 week prior. Pierre Wache stated bluntly via Motorsport Week on August the 13th that they see a different problem every time the car goes on track. Both Verstappen and Hadjar reportedly felt the RB22 coming apart during sessions. Yet the extension happened anyway. The timeline proves these aren't separate stories. They're concurrent realities existing in the same week, forcing us to accept that Verstappen's decision matrix operates on completely different parameters than anyone expected. Numbers tell part of this story. 4.5 additional years, extension through 2030, announcement timed for August 20 ahead of Zandvoort. Previous contract had run through 2028. These are concrete facts, but the number that actually defines this moment is unquantifiable. It's the margin between staying and leaving, the invisible distance between continuing a career and ending it prematurely. Verstappen has now crossed back onto the side of staying, but he's shown us exactly how close the edge really is. That awareness changes everything about how we watch him compete going forward, because we now know that his presence isn't guaranteed by contractual obligation alone. It's maintained by conditions that remain partially hidden from public view, conditions involving regulatory discussions and interpersonal dynamics that could shift again without warning. Picture this for a second. You're the best employee at your company, universally acknowledged as irreplaceable, and instead of demanding a fix for the broken equipment that's making your job miserable, you sign a contract extension based entirely on a promise that someone will eventually figure out how to repair it. That is precisely the psychological position Verstappen occupies right now, having committed his prime years to an organization whose own technical leadership cannot currently guarantee basic operational stability. This isn't optimism. It's a wager placed against present evidence, which makes it fundamentally different from every other top driver extension we've witnessed in the modern era. Pierre Wache didn't soften his assessment when speaking via Motorsport Week on August the 13th. He stated flatly that the team tries to maximize performance but has no confidence in the RB22, explaining that they encounter a different problem every single time the car touches the track surface. That admission came roughly 7 days before the contract announcement, meaning Verstappen signed with full knowledge that his engineers were essentially troubleshooting blind. Structural integrity concerns have emerged alongside the handling issues, with both drivers reportedly feeling the chassis coming apart during sessions. The operating window is so narrow that minor weather shifts or track temperature changes render the car volatile and unpredictable. These aren't development growing pains. They're systemic failures in a machine built under entirely new 2026 technical regulations powered by the in-house Red Bull powertrain's Ford unit following the Honda split. Car fails repeatedly. Engineers lack answers. driver stays anyway. That sequence defies conventional paddock logic, where competitive machinery typically precedes long-term commitments. Yet Verstappen cited Red Bull's demonstrated ability to develop their way out of trouble as a key factor, specifically referencing the team's 2025 comeback from a 104-point championship deficit. He's banking on institutional memory rather than current performance data, trusting that the same organizational muscle that erased a massive points gap last year can somehow diagnose and cure fundamental flaws in a completely different regulatory package. Whether that trust is justified remains unproven, because the problems plaguing the RB22 aren't the same ones the team solved 12 months ago. They're novel challenges born from unfamiliar power unit architecture and aerodynamic concepts that nobody has fully mastered yet. What's really on the line here is whether Verstappen's faith in process over product represents visionary patience or catastrophic miscalculation. If Red Bull unlocks the RB22's potential before season's end, this extension looks like a masterstroke of loyalty timed perfectly ahead of a resurgence. But if the structural and operational issues persist into 2027, he'll have locked himself into 4 additional years of fighting machinery that his own technical director couldn't vouch for when the ink was still wet. The stakes extend beyond personal results too. By recommitting amid documented dysfunction, Verstappen has effectively staked his reputation on Red Bull's engineering culture, surviving its most severe test since entering the hybrid era. His presence signals to sponsors, personnel, and future recruits that the project remains viable despite public admissions of failure. Withdrawal would have confirmed the crisis. Staying transforms uncertainty into a collective bet that everyone must now honor regardless of short-term pain. This brings us back to something essential. Remember how this all started, with Verstappen admitting he was closer to retiring than changing teams? That confession now reads less like emotional exhaustion and more like the final pressure point before choosing to double down on a flawed system he believes can be fixed. The retirement threat wasn't weakness. It was the catalyst that forced clarity about what actually matters to him beyond trophies and records. Laurent Mekies didn't just inherit a team in crisis when he replaced Christian Horner in July 2025. He inherited a driver who had already told him not to bring up contract talks because his future in the sport was genuinely uncertain. Yet, by August 20, 2026, Verstappen was publicly describing their working relationship via the race as really, really good, very open and transparent, citing that dynamic as a primary reason for committing through 2030, despite the RB22's well-documented struggles. That shift from existential doubt to vocal endorsement represents the single most important variable in this entire extension, because it wasn't car performance or financial terms that closed the deal, but interpersonal trust built during Red Bull's most technically difficult period in over a decade. Mekies addressed this directly in his exclusive Formula 1.com interview, stating that Verstappen wanted to stay from the very first conversations about the extension to the very last. He called retaining the best driver on the grid phenomenal news for Oracle Red Bull Racing, framing the decision as validation of his leadership approach rather than a reaction to competitive recovery. Yahoo Sports and MotorBiscuit quoted him describing Verstappen as the central point of the team, acknowledging that the driver's presence now functions as both stabilizing force and organizational compass during a rebuilding year where results have been inconsistent at best. This isn't standard PR language. It's an admission that the team's identity has become inseparable from one individual's willingness to believe in management, despite contradictory evidence on track. Culture outweighs hardware. Relationships precede results. Trust enables patience. Those 3 principles explain why Verstappen signed while Wache was still publicly expressing no confidence in the car. The technical deficit hasn't disappeared, but the relational foundation has solidified enough to support long-term commitment independent of short-term performance. Mekies' handling of these negotiations is now being evaluated across the paddock as a definitive test of his authority with Formula One. Comms analysis noting that the re-signing carries significance precisely because the situation looked so open mid-season. This wasn't inevitable. It was earned through consistent communication during months when external speculation suggested departure was imminent. What remains unclear is whether this relational capital can survive prolonged competitive failure if the RB22's issues extend into 2027. Verstappen's current faith in Mekies is documented and explicit, but faith operates differently under sustained pressure than it does during transitional periods marked by shared struggle.